Welcome to the Book Awards. This is the show where I will be giving awards to all of my favorite books that I read in 2024. I am your host, Rebecca Nicole, and I decided to do this award style because I read across genres and I have a really hard time choosing between books when genres are going head to head. So now I have all of the books first in genre categories, and then I have some other fun categories at the end that mix things up a bit. And with that, let's get into the best books I read in 2024, starting with fantasy. The nominees for the best fantasy books I read in 2024 are A Clash of Kings. This picks up right where A Game of Thrones left off, and there's a reason these books are so popular. They are wonderful, deep character studies in this world where there is a power struggle going on, and we get to see the motivations of each character in this power struggle. Our next nominee is A Sorceress Comes to Call. In this story, a girl who has grown up with isolation and abuse from her sorceress mother gets the chance to stay with people in another town. The old lady she's staying with suspects something's not right here, and they have to work together to find healing and freedom. And our final nominee for Best Fantasy is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. This is a book I still don't know quite how to describe. In this story, we are following the return of magic to England. We're mostly following these stuffy English magicians. Some of them are practical magicians and some of them are theoretical magicians. And at the start of the story, magic returns to England and disrupts everything. And it's basically the chaos that ensues. I read this as part of a read-along hosted by Hardy's Books, and it was one of the best read-alongs I've been a part of. It was so great to read along and see what different scenes and different themes stood out to each person. We have an entire spoiler discussion on this book over on their channel. And the winner for Best Fantasy goes to A Sorceress Comes to Call. This book just touched me in a very personal, emotional way. Whenever I was reading this, I could not put it down. I was so absorbed in this story and felt like the story was speaking to me. That's why it's the winner here. These are my favorites, so A Sorceress Comes to Call is the award winner here, even though it is going up against absolute titans. All of the books mentioned today are going to be fabulous books that are worth checking out. The next category we have is Best Science Fiction. I actually read more science fiction than I expected this year. I usually lean a lot heavier into fantasy, but I've really enjoyed reading science fiction, and some of these are definitely some of my favorite books of the whole year. The first nominee for Best Science Fiction goes to Do You Dream of Terra-Two? This is a story about grief and loneliness and survival. We are following astronauts who are sent on a 23-year mission to start a base on the planet Terra-Two. This is a one-way mission. Not only will they not be going back to Earth, but if anything goes wrong, there's not much anyone can do to help them. They are leaving the only home they've ever known behind in hope of a better future, and they have to redefine what home means for them. This is a character and journey focused novel, and I had a great time reading it. There's so many quotes in here I absolutely loved. The next nominee for science fiction is This Is How You Lose the Time War. In this book, we are following two rival time travelers who start leaving taunting notes to each other, but over time, they start to share more information and get to know each other and eventually fall in love. This story's told through their letters, so the first half of the story, the reader doesn't really know what's going on because the reader only knows what these characters are sharing with each other. But the reader slowly learns more about these characters over time. This story is unique and fun, and even in the first half where I didn't really know what was going on, I was like, I don't know what's going on, but I'm enjoying reading this. And our third nomination for Best Science Fiction goes to Lost Ark Dreaming. In this story, we are following 3 characters on what is basically the worst day of their life. They must work together to contain this breach in this high-rise tower that they live in. This tower is surrounded by ocean because the part of the world they live in is now covered in water, and they must live in these towers. And there's also kind of this hierarchy within the towers where undersea is considered lesser and higher in the tower is more important. These 3 characters don't have much in common, but they must work together if they are to contain this breach. And they're faced with threats from both outside and inside the tower. And the winner of Best Science Fiction goes to Lost Ark Dreaming. I read this novella early in the year and it skyrocketed to my best of the year and has stayed there throughout the entire year. I actually read this book originally and then I started re-listening to the audiobook just today, and I'm just like back in this world and reminded of why I love this book so much. I love the writing and getting to see the characters, and I love the message in this story. In our next category, we have Best Non-Speculative Novel. This is for all of the books that I read that are not science fiction or fantasy. This is a category that I want to focus on reading more in the coming year, and maybe if I read across genres enough in the coming year, I'll break this category out even further. But as of now, it's just all of the fiction that I read that doesn't fit in science fiction and fantasy. The first nominee for this category is The Banned Book Club. This is a graphic novel that follows a character in South Korea living under a military regime. When this character goes to college, this character gets invited to a banned book club, which is basically a resistance group against the government. This is a true life story. Some of the events have been changed and some of the people have been combined into a single character in this story, but this story is still heavily inspired by the author's real life stories. The next nominee is The Bluest Eye. This is about a young girl growing up in a Black community, and she wants to have blue eyes because whenever she looks around her, blue eyes is like the height of beauty. It is the standard, and she sees other little white girls with blue eyes being treated so much better than she is, and she longs for that. She's looking for love. And this story covers the cycles of trauma and abuse, mainly from a little girl growing up and through her eyes. And the third nomination for non-speculative fiction is Escaping Mr. Rochester. This is a Jane Eyre retelling. We are following Jane and Bertha, and Mr. Rochester is not the romantic hero. In this book, Jane and Bertha team up and plan to escape Thornfield Manor. As much as I love the original, I love this interpretation of Jane Eyre, as I don't particularly care for Mr. Rochester, and I loved seeing this reimagining. And the winner of the non-speculative fiction category is The Bluest Eye. This book, has such an impact on me. I also buddy read this book. I read this one. Oh, who's all the people I read it with? I read this one as a buddy read in the Fireside Discord with Joanna and Micah and Christine and Matt. And I really think buddy reading this one elevated the story for me even more than I would have otherwise, because I was able to not only pick up the things that I was reading in the story, but also gain from the things that other people in the story were picking up and discussing. And this book definitely is going to live on in my head for a very long time. Moving on to Best Nonfiction. I read some absolutely amazing nonfiction this year, and this is definitely a genre I will be exploring more in the coming years. Our first nominee for nonfiction is 10 Days in a Madhouse. This book is written by a journalist who intentionally got herself committed to an insane asylum in the late 1800s, so that way she could report on the conditions in the insane asylum. She wrote about this in the newspaper at the time, and people wanted her to write a book about her story, so she went on to write this book. The next nominee in this category is Wild New World. This is a book chronicling the life of humans and animals in the Americas. It follows the story of the Americas from the beginning all the way until now. It talks about how we know, what artifacts, fossils, things we have discovered, what the current hypotheses are on how humans first arrived in America, how animals came to America. This was one that I read with my partner, and I thought it might be boring, but I was at least going to give it a shot. And once I started it, I couldn't put it down. I was so captivated by this book. And my third nominee is The Mercury 13. This book tells the story of 13 women who were trying to become astronauts during the Mercury program in the US, and they were shut out from the program because they were women. It details the tests that they underwent to make sure that they were qualified to be astronauts and the struggles and bureaucracy they were up against. And this story is about 13 women who never made it to space, but they paved the way for the women who came after them. This category is one of the hardest to pick a best book in because all of these books are amazing. If I base my wins on impact on me, I would not go with this particular book because this one will win some of the categories later. But for best nonfiction, I'm going to go with the book that I've recommended the most people, and that is 10 Days in a Madhouse. This was such an interesting look into the past and into the bravery of Nellie to take on this assignment to go into an insane asylum. And she was relying on her employer to pull strings to get her back out, because once she was committed to the insane asylum, there's no guarantee that she would be able to get back out. And it was a fascinating story. It's one of the more hopeful stories of women in history because her reports, whenever she was writing in the paper, actually changed the way the insane asylum was run. It changed some of the laws about insane asylums and how they're run. So this is a very inspirational story while also being about a very difficult topic. The next category I have is definitely a unique category that might not show up in future years, and that is best plays. So I read the scripts of 2 plays this year. The first nominee I have for this category is RUR. This play is the play that coined the term robot. We literally use that term because of this play. This play was written in the 1920s and is very readable even today. It is about the owner of a robot factory. He is constructing robots without the flaws of humans. And it's basically about what makes us human, with the backdrop of a robot rebellion. And the next nominee for this category is Macbeth. Macbeth is a classic for a reason. It is the story of the ambitious Lord and Lady Macbeth and their eventual downfall. And the winner of this category is Macbeth. I reread this play this year because I was reading several Macbeth retellings, and I was really hopeful that I would find a proper Macbeth retelling, and unfortunately they all fell flat for me. But I am excited to keep trying because the story of Macbeth, while the play might be a little bit hard to understand at times because of the language it's written in, the story still comes through and is still an interesting story to read today. The next category I have is best book that I reread in 2024. Surprisingly, out of the last 5 years, this is probably the year that I reread the fewest books, but I still went back to some of my absolute favorites. So for best reread, the first nominee I have is Macbeth, which I have talked about previously. The next nominee I have is His Majesty's Dragon. This follows a naval captain during the Napoleonic Wars who accidentally becomes a dragon rider and must join what is, in his opinion, a disreputable dragon air force. He learns to overcome this prejudice as he develops a strong and lasting bond with the delightful Temeraire, who is very curious and often questions why they must follow social norms. And the third nominee for Best Reread goes to The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. This is a slice of life story as we follow a human who has a past to hide and joins a multi-species crew on a spaceship that is on a mission to the far edges of the galaxy. In this book, we learn more about each member of this crew, their different species, how they live, what they consider home and family, and really this search for belonging among the crew members. And the winner of this category is His Majesty's Dragon. I literally have this series as one of the backdrops in my videos. This is one of my favorite series of all time, and this is another one that I just reread again at the end of the year. I read this book in January of 2024 and in December of 2024. I reread it twice. I feel like the nominee or the award has to go to His Majesty's Dragon. Every time I read this book, it just feels like I'm coming home. The next category I have is Best 2024 Release. I read several books released in 2024, and these are my nominees for the best of the best. First nominee is A Sorceress Comes to Call, which I already talked about in the fantasy category. My next nominee is The Dead Cattail Assassins. This is a fun adventure story where we follow a zombie assassin. Whenever you die, you can pledge to a different god, and our main character has pledged her service to the goddess of assassins. She has to follow the assassin's code, but the job she is sent on goes disastrously wrong. As someone who does not picture stories very well whenever I'm reading them, this is one of the books I was able to picture the best, and I had such a fun time reading this book. And the next nominee I have for 2024 releases is Escaping Mr. Rochester, which I've also talked about previously in the non-speculative fiction section. And the winner for Best 2024 releases is A Sorceress Comes to Call. As I said, this book just spoke to me on a very personal level, and it's also the book that has made me interested in trying horror stories. I have really only experienced horror through film or TV shows, and I've not liked my experience in those mediums, but I realized I've not really tried to read horror in book form. And Kingfisher is slowly pushing me towards trying horror with her dark, borderline horror, cozy fantasy books. The next category is the best backlist books that I read. All of these are books that were released prior to 2024. They honestly are all books that have been on my TBR a while, and I read them in 2024. And my nominees are Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, The Bluest Eye, and A Clash of Kings. I talked about all of these books in the previous sections they were nominated for, but the book that is going to win the best backlist book that I read in 2024 is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I probably would not have read this book this year. It would continue to languish on my TBR if it was not for the buddy read with Hardy's books. And I enjoyed that experience so much. I was enjoying the book, but even up until halfway through the book, I wasn't quite committed to it. It was like, I'm enjoying this, but this is really long and not sure where it's going and why. And then I hit this moment just over halfway and I was hooked and I could not put the book down. I had to finish it. I had to know what happened. And like looking back, this book was brilliant, and I am sure it's going to seem even more brilliant on rereads whenever I'm reading that first half and realize where all these pieces are going and how they're going to fall in place. The next category I have is Best Short Story. So I actually got into reading short stories a little bit this year, which I've not read as much previously, and I've really enjoyed my time with them. So here are the 3 best short stories I read in 2024, starting with The Ones Who Walk Away from Novellas. This is the short story that kind of kicked off my short story reading for the year. This is the story of a utopia. And this is a conversation with the reader about why the reader does not accept that there is a perfect utopia without a dark side. And I really love how Ursula K. Le Guin challenges this, and especially how she challenges how we view happiness, how we consider pain and sadness to be a more intelligent emotion, and how we might look down on those who only experience happiness. And this, I love the exploration here. The next short story on my list is No One Will Come Back for Us. This is the titular story in the collection No One Will Come Back for Us, and I'm still mulling this one over. I feel like if I reread this, maybe I would get even more out of this. Honestly, if I reread all of the stories on this list, maybe I would get even more out of them. In this story, we are following a young journalist who is in the global south reporting on a new disease outbreak. This is a disease without a cure that is spreading rapidly. Our journalist goes in quite ignorant of local customs and makes some bad assumptions about the people there and why the disease is found there. And one of the patients escapes from the hospital, and the journalist joins as they go to track down this patient to stop the spread of this disease. There's also a lot of weird things happening in the surrounding area of the hospital, in the places where people are catching the disease, and our main character has to grapple with all of this as they uncover the source of the mysterious events. And the third nominee I have in this category is I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. This follows the last humans on Earth as they are subject to the whims of their computer overlord. The computer is angry, and the computer is inflicting terrible things on the humans. This is a story about the horrors of human consciousness. And the winner of this category goes to I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. This is the first story marketed as horror that I have intentionally picked up and read, and I loved it. I loved the exploration of the horror of human consciousness. The computer is given consciousness and is angry about it and is taking it out on humans because humans were the ones who gave the computer consciousness. But it is a horrible experience for the humans. What the computer is doing is horrible, and it is a dark story. And you really feel how terrible consciousness can be, and I loved it. What does that say about me? I don't know. For my next category, I have best tomes. These are books that are over 500 pages. And my nominees for this category are Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, A Clash of Kings, both of which have been nominated for previous categories, and The Spear Cuts Through Water. The Spear Cuts Through Water is one of the most unique stories I have ever read, and I'm not even sure how best to describe it. The story is told in first, second, and third person. It starts with second person. The story is being told to you by your Lola, but you also see the story through other characters' perspectives. We are following two characters at an uprising and end of an empire, but it's really their journey. They're traveling with a intelligent, smelly tortoise who can talk, and the tortoise is not the only one. There are several of them, and they all can connect to each other. And I don't know how to explain this book. I feel like this is a story that if I reread, I would get so much more out of this story. This definitely seems like one that I could reread and pick up something new and different in each time. And the winner for the best tomes category is A Clash of Kings. There's a reason this book is as popular as it is. There's a reason this series is as popular as it is. And while I have watched the show, I'm reading through the books for the first time and getting to see the characters' internal thoughts is absolutely wonderful. There were times in this book, particularly from Catelyn and from Theon, that their internal thoughts really gives me a different perspective on their actions and really makes me understand them better. I feel like these books are character studies, and I absolutely love that. And this is one, like, I want to make a video still. It's been months since I read this book, but I want to make a video on the different characters in this book and what I took away from this book. So maybe look out for that video in the future. My next category is Best Novellas. My first nominee is Lost Ark Dreaming, which I've talked about in a previous category. My next nominee is The Practice, The Horizon, The Chain. In this story, we are following a teen boy who has lived among the chained workers. He has chosen to live among the educated elite. And while he's struggling to adjust to his new life, he starts to see the metaphorical chains that bind those he now lives around. This story has absolutely beautiful writing. I was so captivated by this, I didn't want to put it down once I started it. It's one of those that I could get absolutely lost in. This is another one where there is quotes on almost every page. And my next nominee is In the Shadow of the Fall. This is the story about an acolyte who's continually unable to ascend to priesthood because the gods refuse to talk to her. And this is her journey of self-discovery as she learns what the world is really about. We see this story from two perspectives, both our protagonist and our antagonist perspective. And our antagonist is a shapeshifter who can show up in any form. So sometimes when we're reading the story from the protagonist perspective, we don't know if the shapeshifter's there because the shapeshifter could be taking on a form that would seem normal in these scenes. This really raised the stakes of this story as we also went on a personal exploration and a coming of age story. And the winner for Best Novella goes to Lost Ark Dreaming. As I said, this was one of my favorite reading experiences this year. It's a story I still think about a lot and am really glad that I read. The next category I have is Most Underrated. This is basically a category to highlight some of the books that I read this year that have very few people rating them, have very few people talking about them on the bookish internet, on the review sites, and I think deserve more praise. And my nominees are Lost Ark Dreaming, The Practice, The Horizon, The Chain, In the Shadow of the Fall, Do You Dream of Terra-Two? And the winner of this category is The Practice, The Horizon, The Chain. I am choosing this as the winner because it is a close runner-up to Lost Ark Dreaming, and I think this is probably the one that most people will like and find something, some exploration in this book that connects with them. And I recommend you check this one out. I think all of these in this category are underrated. If you only check one of them out, check out The Practice, The Horizon, The Chain. And my next category is a book I am most likely to reread in the coming year. My nominees for this category are The Spear Cuts Through Water, Do You Dream of Terra-Two, A Sorceress Comes to Call, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. And the winner of this category goes to The Spear Cuts Through Water. Honestly, all of them in this category are books that I am likely to reread in the coming year, but The Spear Cuts Through Water is the one that's highest priority to reread because I feel like there's so much in this book that I would benefit from a reread. I would probably, upon rereading it, maybe be able to explain the story better. And I would enjoy my time going through this book once again. As you might have noticed in my previous category, I included 4 books instead of 3 in my nominees. These last 3 categories are so hard for me to narrow it down to just 3, so I'm allowing myself to include more books in these categories. All of the books in these categories are ones that have been nominated for previous awards, and these are just some fun categories to make them go head to head. My next category is a book that I can't stop thinking about. And all of the books in this category are books that I continue to think about since I turned the last page. The nominees are The Practice, The Horizon, The Chain, Wild New World, A Sorceress Comes to Call, The Bluest Eye, Lost Ark Dreaming. And the winner for this category is Wild New World. Wild New World changed my life this year. It is the book that has impacted me the most. I decided to read it with my partner. You know, I'll give the book a shot. Doesn't sound that interesting, but I'll try it. And I couldn't put it down. And now I am reading other books about natural history, about prehistory. I didn't know this was a topic I was interested in until I read this book, and it has changed my life. So while all of the books in this category are books that I can't stop thinking about, I think this is the one that I continue to think about the most. And for my final category, I have to pick the book of the year. This is one book that I am calling the best book that I read this year. This is, of course, according to me. All of these awards are awards that I personally am giving based on my feelings for these books. If you've read any of these books and would choose differently, let me know in the comments. Let's discuss these awesome books. And the nominees for Best Book of the Year is The Bluest Eye, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, A Sorceress Comes to Call, Lost Ark Dreaming, and Wild New World. And the winner of this category is Wild New World. This is the easiest best book of the year I have ever chosen. It's also the most different from books that I normally read. I think this is a testament to reading outside the genres you typically read, reading outside the type of books you typically read, because reading this one book that's very far outside the books that I typically read has changed my life. I started reading The Lost World of the Dinosaurs because I read Wild New World this year. I have so many books about natural history and prehistory that I added to my TBR because I want to learn about it all. That I am so fascinated by this. I'm obsessed. Honestly, I literally can't stop thinking about it. It's something I talk about all the time with my partner now. He had no idea whenever he said, hey, let's read this together, what it would mean. I am so glad he pushed me to read something outside my comfort zone. But how about you? What is your book of the year or books of the year if you can't choose? Let me know in the comments, and thank you for coming along with this award show. I hope you have a great year of reading ahead of you.